Welcome everybody to China and Global Times, a double book launch event. I'm Jeffrey Wasserstrom, and this event is being held here at UC Irvine, as well as accessible to people tuning in anywhere in the world. It is the first live event at Irvine that I've been part of since early 2020. So we're moving gradually back into these kinds of events. The main sponsor of this is the Forum for the Academy and the Public, which is a UCI organization directed by literary journalism professor Amy Willets that seeks to break down divides between different disciplines and between the academy and outside of the academy. So we often do events with journalists. This event, there are going to be a series of what we are calling book slams, which introduce more than one book at a time with authors and sometimes commentators on the authors as well. In this case, it's very exciting. We have two authors of much buzzed about books in of very different kinds, except that they both engage with China and they both deal with China's changing place in the world, a topic of great interest in many ways, in part because China's place in the world has changed so dramatically over the last few decades and enormously over the last century or so. So we will have the two authors joining us long distance via Zoom from other parts of the world. And they are journalist Joanna Chiu, who has just published China Unbound, A New World Disorder, a book that's come out to very good positive reviews and press coverage. And then also Isabella Weber, who is the author of How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate, which is also generating a great deal of discussion and debate and reviews. And I actually can't remember the last time that a book by an economist about China generated so much attention. So it's a real treat and a pleasure to have the two of them here. And in the spirit of interdisciplinarity and of crossing borders, not just between the academy and the wider world, but between different schools within a single institution, which sometimes operate very much in their own worlds. We have, as commentators here present with me, Greg Shaffer from the law school, who has also just published a new book that could easily have been part of a book launch itself, Emerging Powers of the World Trade System, which just came out in 2021 as well. So Greg is over here from the law school, and joining him is my colleague here from the School of Humanities, Judy Wu, who is a historian and a professor of Asian American Studies here, and also directs the Humanities Center, which is the main host of this event. And Judy has written extensively on US foreign relations, but including, among many other things, has dealt with the early delegation of travelers from the United States to China as it was beginning to open up to the world. And so they'll each be commenting specifically on one of the two books, but in part on both of them. I will shut up quite quickly after here and then turn over to the two book presenters. And I wanted to launch things out by asking a pair of questions for each of them to respond to that are very, very broad. And they're going to give just short presentations, not as long as the kind of book presentations that they might ordinarily do. And the comments will be short as well to maximize the ability for us to move to conversation among the panelists and with people in the room and tuning in on Zoom with questions to ask. But my two questions to start things off are to ask each of the authors to say something about what is in their book that they think would surprise people coming to it or surprise a general audience, and also talk about something that surprised them as they were working on it. And we'll begin with Isabella, who's a professor at UMass Amherst, I should have mentioned, to answer those two questions. And her book really deals with the 1980s and the rapidly changing place of China in the world then. So chronologically, I think it makes sense to start with her and then move to Joanna, who has covered China extensively as a journalist and also tracked China's influence around the world, to answer the same two questions about her book. So without further ado, thanks so much for joining us from where you are. And I look forward to hearing your conversation.
So it's my time now, right? Just to be sure. Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Jeff, for putting this together. It's really terrific to have such an exciting format and in hybrid and a book slam. I've given many book talks already, but this one is special. So thank you so much for putting this together and for the opportunity to join this discussion. And thanks to the commentators for taking the time to join this event today. So the two questions in my limited time, I think that key takeaways from my book are that China's gradualist marketization was not predetermined by Chinese culture or the nature of the Chinese economy, society, or its state, but instead that in the 1980s, there was a true crossroads. Things could have gone differently. There was early on an agreement amongst Chinese economic reformers and reform economists that more market was necessary in China's pursuit of economic development. But the question was how to marketize, whether to destroy the plan to make space for the market, which is basically the logic of shock therapy, which proved to be detrimental in other contexts and which was very much present in China, not only in academic debates, but also in the form of political initiatives. Or whether to let go of the control at the margins, that is to let go the control of small sectors, small commodities, nevertheless maintain control over the core of the system and use the old institutions, in fact, use the institutions of the plan to create markets and to participate in markets in order to stabilize and steer the economy as a whole. The first logic, that of shock therapy, is then not only about the speed of transformation, but it is about the basic logic of the relationship between the state and the market. Shock therapy is based on the idea that the market and the state should be separate spheres and that the state should govern the economy through indirect control. On the other hand, China's gradualist experimentalism emerges as relying on a mutually constitutive relationship between the state and the market, where the state has been shaped as much through marketization as the market through state guidance. So there's no clear division, no clear separation, and what emerges is some sort of a new economic system. When I was a master's student in 2013-14, trying to work on China's 1980s, trying to convince political scientists that this mattered, trying to convince historians that the 1980s was history, I could not have imagined that my book would arouse so much interest and that would speak so directly to the kind of crossroads that China and the world is facing today. If we come from the perspective of the separation of state and market, and if we see marketization as a withdrawal of the state, then the current situation appears as a sudden shift, a return of the state. However, if we come from the perspective of a mutually constituted relationship between the state and the market, then the current situation is a new stage in a long-standing battle over finding the right balance between state and market. Thank you very much.
Great, a wonderful, wonderfully concise. Great. Joanna?
Wow, thank you. Now I need to try to be as concise and engaging. So Isabella, you set a high bar. So the question was what I think readers would probably find surprising in the book and important in the book. I've done, quite a few talks now because the book was released last month, and what people express most surprise at is the really broad level of targets of China's foreign influence activities. So the so-called United Front Work Department is actually an official department of the CCP that is expected to have actually thousands of people in employment. And that's not surprising to me, but it does surprise others, because people like a Canadian political hopeful who was running for city council in his small town in Canada, where he said cows outnumber people, place with 500 people, he received an invitation from the Chinese Foreign Ministry to go on an all expense paid trip to China. And that's an example of that soft power, China really wanting to reach out to potential allies all over the world, using flattery, using things like these VIP paid trips to try to win favor. But on the other side, there are also other tactics of foreign influence that I try to convey in my book, which is an effort to make these broad geopolitical questions engaging on a human level. So I traveled all over, the Western world, and I use the term the West critically because I also provide histories on Western colonialism and how that has created an ongoing effect in China on the psyche of Chinese leaders of not wanting that humiliation anymore. And some of the targets of foreign influence are people as, small potatoes, as a student from China who is studying in Canada with 2 followers on Twitter. And he was only using the platform as a way to experiment with what it was like to access the unrestricted internet outside China for the first time. And he shared only a few posts, including a satirical video that was mildly critical of Xi Jinping. And his family back home in China received a visit from police saying, "Your son is up to something in Canada, tell him to stop." And he received then a phone call from Chinese police saying, "We know what you did, we trace your IP address, we know this is your account, delete those posts or else your family will face trouble." So this is someone who is not well known at all. He is not a public figure, and people like that are living in fear and feeling that even if they're in, a democratic country, that, their free speech is still curtailed. They still worry about their family members back home because they are a target of China's foreign influence activities. And I try to provide nuance and context behind these activities in the book. Why particularly the student who was studying law is a particularly an interesting target to Beijing. So I think that has surprised many people. As far as what surprised me in my research for this book, where I went to Greece, Italy, Australia, around North America, and Turkey, was that not just in Canada or the US, but in many places, the level of expertise and the quality of advisors that governments have on China are very shockingly lacking. In Greece, people said that there's no way to study China at schools in Greece. Same in Italy, people said that they had to pursue their graduate studies on China overseas. They weren't really able to, there wasn't that tradition of being even interested in China until recently. In the meantime, politicians in these countries have been talking about China as a way to really solve a lot of its problems. In Italy, the previous governments said that China would, take over many of its ports. Italian media reports provided, all of this hearsay that Beijing was going to come in and turn over Italian factories that were about to shut down, that they were going to turn it all around. But when I went and to Sicily and spoke with the mayor of Palermo, he said there was no such deal in place. So in the absence of opportunities to learn about China, in the absence of advisors on China in the government, I think there's a real risk that China discourses in a lot of the Western world is actually dominated by misinformation, by rumors, and by exaggerations on China, where China's more of an idea rather than an actual place. And we're not even talking about the facts of what is happening. It is as if information on China that's in Chinese is just a secret code that can't be cracked, that's up for actual Western interpretation. It's as if it's, reading tea leaves rather than, drawing on the great pool of experts that we do have all around the world to inform government policies.
Thanks so much. All right, so now we'll move on to the comments. So Greg, actually the commentators mentioned that, so our colleague from the law school will be talking about the more historical book, and our historian colleague will be talking about the more contemporary book.
Yes. Great, thank you, Jeff. And thank you, both of you, Isabel and Joanna. These are two wonderful books, and it's great to put them in conversation because they're, in a sense, such different books, but clearly about a similar topic. One book really is about China in the 1980s. It is internally looking at what's going on in China. We actually have experts from outside of China coming into China with whom Chinese are talking about, potential alternative reforms for the Chinese economy and alternative moves towards marketization. Of course, the other book is about contemporary China, and it's external, about China on the road, and China perceived now as a threat. China now is a great power. And so clearly we see sort of with these two books, the shift in context today regarding China. And so trying to put this in conversation. First of all, what's remarkable about, I think, Isabella's book, which I'll focus, is it's really wonderful to see an economic history book written by Western economists with only Chinese sources, right? Even traditionally, just in the West, there's a sense of with Western triumphalism and sort of and Western power, that Western paradigms are the ones that you should look at everything, right? Be it a liberal, how to organize politics or how to organize an economy. And this book goes inside China, but it's based on two methods, which are great. One is looking at historic texts through contemporary times and the contemporary texts. And the second is interviewing. So it's a technique that you don't see a lot of economists, at least that I've read and that I've worked with, using. And so it gives a really rich internal sense of the debates. It opens up China to really see the internal debates that the Chinese were engaged in trying to make very difficult decisions. And the book sort of puts forth sort of two different parallel logics, which I think are quite relevant today. One is what you see in economics and here in the United States as well. One is sort of traditional neoclassical economics, which is based on models, equilibrium models, or based on assumptions using deductive logic. And Isabella looks for parallels with sort of this sort of ideal type theorizing within traditional Chinese texts about the economy. And another sort of logic is more inductive, building from facts on the ground, building from experience, building from experiments, experimentation. And you see these two logics at play within the book, sort of in terms of different approaches. And one, of course, involves the advice for shock therapy for rapid marketization based on, models of what this, the economic growth impacts that this would have. And the other is much more experimental, gradualist, crossing the river by feeling the stones and so forth, case by case analysis, revising plans based on new developments and new contexts. And so that's, it's really remarkable because it really opens up sort of understanding what took place in China in the 1980s in new ways. You can see parallel not only in debates here in the United States within economics, but also within law, my profession. Do you see law, sort of the importance of sort of clear formal rules, a more formalist approach to law, or what I would consider, where I put myself, a more realist approach to law, where law needs to adapt pragmatically to different social contexts over time. And those are major debates. And I can't help but point out sort of parallels, at least what Isabella's found in my own sort of empirical research on China with respect to how China built legal capacity in the 2000s to take on the United States, Europe, in international trade disputes. And they did so in a sense by trying to feel their way, right? Gradually building capacity both in the state and in the private sector. And so you sort of see this public-private coordination, with the result being, in a sense, a building of legal infrastructure to parallel all the other types of infrastructure development you see in China, and enhance state capacity in the process. What's wonderful also about the book, with this parallels with Joanna's, is that, so often the way China is characterized in the United States is in a monolithic way. And this really shows, the internal debates that go on within China, how rich they were, and of course, how rich they are today. And so I guess the final thing I'm going to say is sort of relevance, thinking in terms of today's context of Joanna's book. I think there are probably three different areas of contemporary debate. One is simply overdevelopment economics. Clearly, what models are countries going to look to? Are they going to look to sort of World Bank type neoliberal models? Or are they going to look to China's very successful economic development model, and what sort of impact it's going to have on development economics? The second is Western internal debates, right? So how do we see, especially with, we're talking about the commanding heights in the digital economy and high tech, what's the role of the state? And you see sort of, economists such as Mazzucato and others sort of stressing the importance of the state in R&D, research development, to move the economy along, especially with the different crises that we face from climate change, pandemics, and so forth today. And then the third is what I'm writing about right now, which is sort of US-European debates over how to deal with China. And most of these debates you see, and this is a continuity from the Trump to the Biden administration in the United States, but you see this shifting over to the European Commission, obviously under US pressure, but still these developments within Europe, the way I see them, is that now that China is an economic power, you hear this language that, China's cheating, it's unfair. The use of state-owned enterprises and state subsidies gives China unfair advantages. And so we need new global rules to rein in China, the form of the World Trade Organization and so forth. So China basically, this is a quote from a major European economist, André Sapir, in his new book with Petros Mavroidis, a lawyer, saying basically China has to become more like us. And actually in that book, they used the term the West to define liberalism 77 times. I copied it. And that China basically, needs to become like the West. Otherwise, global governance will all explode. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Judy. Great, Judy.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I wish I could actually meet you in person, Isabel and Joanna. I wanted to just introduce a little bit about who I am and what I do to provide a context for how I'm going to be commenting on Joanna's book. So I'm a professor in Asian American Studies, and I teach courses on US and Asia. So I think about the international, but as a way to think about how these international dynamics have shaped domestic race relations in the United States. So how has war, empire, economic trade, tensions, diplomacy, how does that shape the ways in which people who are perceived as coming from those countries, the way their status is regarded in the United States? And I think this is a topic that's very much at the forefront of us politically, just most recently with the pandemic and the labeling of the pandemic as a China flu, as a Kung flu, and how that correlates with the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans. And this is something that Joanna talks about in her book. So I'm going to talk about her book, and I have to say that I read it on Halloween. It truly is a frightening book, the way it depicts the global reach of China. And the title of the book is called China Unbound. I think the subtitle is Creating a New World Disorder. So it gives you the sense of the overwhelming threat that is being unearthed through very thorough research. There's a merging of the political and the economic agenda by the PRC that has led to both an exacerbation of wealth inequality in the country and also political repression democracy advocates. So there's a chapter on Hong Kong, there's a chapter on Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and that these atrocities do not just stop at China's border, which itself is being disputed, right, by these different movements in these locations, as well as by the Taiwan independence movement. But as the book suggests, China Unbound, China's embarked on a global agenda through the New Silk or West and Belt Initiative, and that by investing in transportation infrastructure around the world in the name of promoting trade, the PRC is staking claim on ports around the world. And these investments are welcomed by what Joanne characterizes as middle powers, countries that don't have the same status as global superpowers like the United States or Russia or even Germany, but places instead like Canada, Australia, Italy, and Greece are eager for these trade investments. And in return, as Joanne has documented, that these countries, or at least some of these leaders, are turning a blind eye to human rights abuses in the People's Republic of China. These investments are being made through personal contacts, state-to-state relationships, but also through the reach of what Joanne described as the United Front initiative, in which they are harassing, digitally harassing, using phones, using intimidation tactics, trying to extradite people who might be seen as critics of the PRC, and potentially enlisting people as spies within the overseas Chinese populations. So you can get a sense why I was so scared as I was reading the book. But I wanted to share some three insights about the book and also to raise some questions for Joanne to consider. So I'm very struck by the title, China Unbound, which evokes for me the story of Prometheus Unbound. It's a play by Shelley. And it's about the tragic mythical figure Prometheus who gives fire to human beings and then is eternally punished by the gods, according to Greek mythology. And I'm interested in why you chose this particular title. I can see the parallels. The idea that China invented gunpowder, that invented fireworks, it's giving fire, it's suffered through over a century of Western humiliation to colonization. And now it's seeking to be unbound, to gain a sense of global dominance. And I think Prometheus is in some ways a tragic character and perhaps a sympathetic character. But in this book, China is the bad guy. So I'm interested in your title. Second, I really want to applaud Joanne for going beyond a Beijing-Washington focus in thinking about US-China relations, and even going beyond sort of the global world powers, but really thinking about these middle powers, right? Thinking about the ways in which China and these lesser recognized nations play a role in international trade and diplomacy. And I was really interested in your choice to focus on different countries in the West. And if maybe some of these conversations might shift if you look at countries in Asia, or economic investments in Asia or in Africa. And finally, I appreciate the call for nuance and truth-telling, and also the call for the upholding the political values of Western political liberalism, which she, I think, offers as a possible solution to what is happening. And she fittingly ends her book by focusing on the United States and the disinformation campaign that's been circulating here, the reigniting of a Cold War mentality in which those who are calling for tough stances, tough rhetoric are being promoted politically and in the media. But I also wondered if some of the findings in the book might reinforce those political stances. And it seems like there are tendencies of this that are being documented in the book. This kind of, sorry, I'm talking about this. Your book overall tends to paint a very overwhelmingly portrait of a totalitarian, authoritarian, global coordinated effort. I think with less attention to some of the internal debates, although they're mentioned. And that, I think, overall portrayal justifies the politics towards surveillance and towards racial harassment, which exists in Western countries. So if overseas Chinese are subject to such political and personal pressures, why might a host country seek to protect these individuals from the PRC, as opposed to try to exclude these individuals from these nations and potentially having to become security risks? And again, I think in Joanne's interviews with residents around the world, there is that tendency to blame the people who live there of Chinese descent and associate them with a Chinese economic and global agenda. I'm also just curious if, given the attacks and the arrests of journalists, you yourself are concerned about traveling back to China and potential implications of your work. I also wanted to question the solution in terms of Western liberalism. Various academics and academics have been criticizing nations that proclaim themselves to be Western liberal democratic societies, but are in fact practicing the same types of authoritarian politics as the Chinese. So the willingness to sacrifice human beings in the name of profit, the use of state violence against protesters, the path to turn a blind eye towards totalitarian government, the restriction of political rights of citizens. We're now going through a lot of discussion about voting rights in this country. The detention and disappearance of people who are detained. These are things that are happening in the United States right now. And so I don't want this as an excuse for what's happening in China, but I wonder if China is so exceptional compared to these Western nations that proclaim themselves to be liberal. So I welcome further conversations about what type of solutions we might seek to address economic suffering and also address the limitations of political rights. It's pretty clear that neither the neoliberal model or the socialism model that China is practicing today are offering solutions to these issues. And that this again is kind of a depressing question to end with, but if the idea of Western liberalism itself is a myth, what is the solution? So I'll just end there.
So these are wonderful, wonderful presentations. So much has been laid on the table. I just want to mention a couple of things just as a kind of comment on comments. I love the fact that the attention was drawn to the effort to get beyond seeing the world as though Washington and Beijing were the only two players in this. And I think one of the things that comes out from reading these two books together and thinking more broadly over the course of time is how important other trends in a wider world have been in shaping what we think of as US and China issues. I was also struck by how many of the things that came up in discussion of both books were ones that when I started graduate school in the early 1980s would have been brought up with Japan or Russia being the source of anxiety in very different ways that China is now. That if there was a talk about a new economic developmental model that might be taking ideas that were circulating and putting a new or perhaps unfair spin on them, that would often turn into discussions of Japan. And one of the very sad ironies was that the same racialized attacks came when Japan was being a subject of concern as opposed to China. And in both cases, Asian Americans of different groups within the Asian American community suffered as a point of that, as one kind of parallel. When there were discussions of other issues of influence, then sometimes it would be Russia that would be discussed. But in both these cases, to remind us of how important in the debates about economic change, paying attention to places like Hungary, paying attention to places that didn't fit easily into categories were in the debates that Isabella was talking about. And in Joanna's case, looking at very different places like Italy and Greece. But I have to say, as the historian, there's a real irony to Italy now not feeling that it's a great center for knowledge about China. Because if you go back several centuries, Italy was the only place that was studying China because they had connections through the church. So there's also a way that countries is not only, history doesn't move in a steady direction. Sometimes there are odd kinds of reversals. Chinese reformers were fascinated in the 19th century by Italy, which seemed to be surging forward, had been a great ancient country, had then been left behind and seemed to be surging forward again. And they thought of Italy as a kind of model for what China could do, which is now something so far removed from what we would imagine. But anyway, there have been some specific questions put to you that I'm sure you want to respond to before we then move into a more conversational mode and take questions from the live audience here and via chat from Zoom. So Isabella, do you want to start and then Joanna responding?
Sure, thank you. Let me begin by thanking Professor Shaffer for these really wonderful comments. I think it's really fascinating if someone comments on your book and you suddenly see things clearer than yourself. And this was that kind of moment. So thank you so much. I guess the last 3 points are the questions that I should be picking up on. So there was a question of the development model and what countries are going to look at in terms of World Bank neoliberalism versus China. So the way that I'm trying to think about it is that the big lesson that emerges from China's experience in the 1980s is that there may not be a model that is transferable from one country to the next, but that instead the task of development is really trying to understand your local conditions in relation to the global economy in great detail and study them very carefully, and then study what other countries have done, but not in order to copy, but in order to understand how some of the logics of operation, some of the policy instruments that have been used elsewhere might be adaptable to the local conditions, which then requires the task of taking these lessons back to the local context and in some sense, in some form, testing them against the local conditions. Is it through actual experiments, as in the case of China, which of course is not always feasible, or through careful analysis of what were the conditions of success in other contexts, and are these conditions available in the respective local context? So in that sense, I think that China's development trajectory and the debates of the 1980s and the ways in which Chinese economists in the 1980s have engaged foreign experiences challenges us to think beyond Washington versus Beijing consensus. The second question of the role of the state, I think that this is absolutely right, that in some sense the Chinese trajectory of the last decades that I think we can agree on today has involved a very strong role of the state, and it is a matter of fact that it has produced one of the fastest periods of growth in modern history. So as such, of course, there are all these things to be criticized and to be taken with more of a container of salt. But nevertheless, the mere fact of the important role of the state in the case of China's development is hard to deny, and I think it certainly has repercussions with the discourse that we are observing in the US and in Europe to some extent as well. Now, on the question of US-China relations and the idea of China somehow cheating its way ahead, and the idea that China has to become like the West. I've recently been reading the work of Deng Yingtao, who was one of the young reform economists in the 1980s, whom I did not dedicate a lot of space to in the book, but whose work has been translated into English, and is of course also available in Chinese. And Deng Yingtao in the early 80s was charged with the task of studying what China would have to do to achieve modest levels of income several decades into the future with several target points. As he was engaging in this task and studying the experiences of Western countries, he came to realize that the energy requirements for the Western kind of industrialization were such that if one was to multiply the per capita requirements by China's population, they would be exhausting the world's non-renewable energies several times over, which led Deng Yingtao to argue already in 1991 that Westernization is not a possibility for China, simply for the reason that that kind of enormously resource-intensive development model cannot be upscaled to the majority, but is a development model that is reserved to a minority that is accruing disproportionate amounts of natural resources into its economies. Now, of course, China has gone very far into the direction of an enormously resource-intensive type of development model, But I think that if we take the energy intensity of GDP growth, which has also been confirmed in a recent publication in Nature Energy, seriously, then it might be a demand that is, from a mere economic and resource perspective, a demand that amounts to asking the impossible. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna.
Right. Wow. Okay. So thank you so much, both Jeff and Judy, for your really great comments. I agree with Isabella. I think hearing your comments kind of made me think about my work with more clarity, which is amazing. I wish I had, spoken with Judy, before I did my series of interviews on the book. So thank you for that. So look, going through your questions, first of all, the title, I wish I was as intelligent to tie it to Prometheus Unbound. That's an amazing comparison. Definitely, I saw a lot of parallels there, China as a tragic figure. But I was more deliberate with the title, the subtitle, A New World Disorder. And what I mean by a new world disorder is not just that this is the fault of Beijing, but the current state of really, really tense relations and a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding is, the West has as much to blame for this current situation. And I do try to provide a lot of some of that historical context. Actually, Jeff was very kind to review some of the historical information in the book, which I was very grateful for, because people do need to know this background to try to understand, for example, why Beijing right now seems to be often overreacting or reacting or cracking down on its own citizens' free speech on the point of paranoia. There is a lot of emotional baggage from recent history, like Isabella working on the 80s, the post-cultural revolution period. Xi Jinping has talked about how he doesn't want to see China disintegrate like the Soviet Union. It's important to not waver from ideology. And Xi's father, he was persecuted in the Cultural Revolution as well as his sister. So the current cohort of leaders kind of, the princelings, like they feel that they have this responsibility to continue the revolution, continue CCP rule, and that it is in danger of failing. So I think it's important to know that context. But so far from, knowing all of this context intimately, a lot of people have reported that if they are experts on China, they have lived in China. Actually, instead of being promoted to levels of influence in government, they're being banned from working for the government because in the US in particular, they're not getting security clearance. I spoke with a well-known expert, Bill Bishop, and someone told him to not even bother applying for a role in government. Even though he has lived in Beijing, he's been an expert commentator on China for decades. You would think that is precisely the type of person you would want advising the government. So that is an issue. As far as some of the findings in my book and similar findings from many researchers that are, scary, kind of spooky, like Halloween. People have said the book is almost like a page turner, like a thriller, that they feel the sense of suspense reading what was happening to all these people who, including people who weren't really deliberately openly criticizing the government, people who were actually acting from a place of patriotism. A lot of the people I met in China who are lawyers, who are academics, they don't want to see the CCP fail. They want to do their part to strengthen their country. And they feel that what's happening now, the trajectory where any dissent is not tolerated, is actually weakening China, is weakening China's ability to respond to the needs and wants of the people. But these people are being persecuted. I wrote about how reporting on a crackdown on lawyers, it would be really just kind of dystopian from my perspective, because I would be talking on these encrypted apps with lawyers and they would stop replying to me because they had just been detained into the system of secret policing where even their closest family members don't know where they are or what kind of crimes they're being suspected of committing. So it's difficult because having lived in China, having really close friends in China, I see, the diversity of views all around me. I see the people who are actually trying to improve their country. But this nuance gets lost in many Western discourses on China. And in fact, I worry that my findings on human rights and the foreign influence campaigns, will be kind of taken without that nuance and care and taken to legitimize really kind of widespread counter crackdowns. Former President Trump has basically said that he thinks that all international students from China should be seen as potential spies and treated with suspicion. There have been prosecution efforts against certain Chinese scholars and scientists that have ended up being embarrassing for US authorities because they were unfounded. So there are concerns that what's happening is an overreaction from Western powers as well, that instead of being really precise in its criticism, that Chinese people as a whole, or even China experts who have lived in China, are treated with suspicion and hostility and not being allowed to play a more prominent role in our discussions. And that is very toxic. And I do worry that what's happening isn't out of genuine concern for human rights, but trying to score political points. Being very hawkish on China is very politically popular in many places. And speaking with folks in the US, they say it's almost a competition to be as tough on China as you can, because merely being critical is not going to get you attention. You have to compete and say something stronger and stronger to get any attention. And that's not the kind of climate where nuance can really live very well. And Judy asks, for overseas Chinese who are being disproportionately targeted, I report on how in Canada and many middle power countries, they've been particularly targeted because perhaps Beijing feels like it can get away with it more in countries that are relatively weaker than the United States. They have received visits from Chinese officials to tell them to not speak up on Hong Kong democracy protests, for example. Why aren't these voices being heard? I've spoken with many of these people, and I try to counter their silencing by actually featuring them prominently in the book. They talk about how they've tried to warn about what has been happening for decades. They've testified to parliaments, but I think it took the detention of two relatable white men from Canada, two Michaels, for more of the public around the world to pay attention and to worry that some negative repercussions of China's increasing authoritarianism and aggressive foreign policy could impact them, not just people who have Chinese backgrounds. So it has really been a very delayed reaction from Western countries. And in its being delayed, it's being kind of taken further, where it becomes a wholesale attacks on Chinese people rather than something more careful and deliberate. Meanwhile, there are increasing attacks on journalists and free press, both in China and around the world. Around the world, a lot of the pressure is financial. Many journalists are losing their jobs because advertising sales can no longer support what they're doing. I myself, I'm right now at a friend's office. I don't have my own office in Vancouver because my newspaper had to shut down its branch here, and we're all working from home. So here in the West, there are less resources, while Beijing has been kicking out foreign journalists, foreign media, people I think who can provide the most detailed and can do the most, reliable fact checking on what China's doing, they're not able to report on the ground. It used to be that if Chinese authorities weren't happy with your reporting, they might let your visa expire and not renew it, or they might give you a shorter visa as a warning to be less critical in your coverage. But what has been happening in recent years is that foreign correspondents have been actually kicked out more obviously. Two Australian television journalists had to spend days hiding in Australian embassies in China because of fear that they would be detained. And in fact, an Australian journalist, Chung Lei, she continues to be detained right now on very vague national security charges, and people do think it's another kind of two Michael situation where it is retaliation for the Australian government being more critical and confrontational towards Beijing as of late. So it's hard to think of solutions and to understand China when our ability to have credible reports from journalists and researchers in China are just diminishing month after month. And I find that really worrying. Okay, and finally, to answer Judy's last point, practicing what you preach, is it right for Western democracies in name to criticize China when a lot of China's authoritarian actions are actually parallel, like they're happening in the US and other countries as well? That is something I tried to address in the book. I excerpted from a really insightful essay from Bobo Lo from the Lowy Institute that I would recommend you look at. He argued that the COVID-19 pandemic and the mishandling of it from Western governments exposes some of these weaknesses in democracies, while what has happened during Trump's presidency, where he allegedly incited riots on the Capitol and he didn't accept the results of a democratic vote, also further puts into question whether the US is in a position to criticize others. Definitely, I think when countries do things like this, it gives Beijing so much ammunition and justification to wave away international criticism as self-interested, as motivated by not concern on human rights and rule of law and democracy, but motivated because countries are worried about China's economic power overtaking their economic power. And I hear so much of these narratives based around a competition with China where the US might lose and China might win, and that's not what you want. And to my chagrin, people have commented on links of my book saying, like, we need to read this to find out what's going on so we can find out how we can beat China. Of course, that is not my motivation for writing. And definitely it's a very difficult situation for many experts on China when our reports and research on human rights and China's political system, lack of rule of law, is kind of overly simplified and used as an excuse to, for example, again, put all international students and scientists and scholars from China under suspicion. So I think the basic starting point, we're not even there yet. Our discourses often aren't based on facts. They're not based on books like from Isabella, where she's relying on Chinese sources. It's, people like Newt Gingrich are publishing books where he's kind of, providing these nonsensical translations of Chinese words and then extrapolating these like really simplistic takeaways from his nonsensical translations of Chinese phrases. So I think before we even talk about like solutions, one of the most obvious starting points is that we need more China expertise as in government, as in positions of influence, as well as able to advise governments.
Okay, thanks so much. I think let's go to questions from, are there ones from in the audience here? And the novelty of a live audience at the moment is still something of a novelty. Please ask your question.
Can you hear me? Hello? Yes? Okay. I have a question for Joanna. What advice could you give to the member of the Chinese diaspora who are stuck in this very precarious situation that you're talking about? Like, is there like a safe country, a safe way of living, a safe way of like comporting yourself so you can be like outside of the political reach of, you know, either the country you're residing in or, you know, China?
Thank you. That's a great question. And again, I think what people found most surprising about my book is that it seems that people who felt that they would never be targets of the Chinese state were in fact targets. Like that student with 2 followers, he was shocked that Chinese police found him important enough to go to his family to intimidate him. And people, like when you think about the 2 Michaels, not even members of the Chinese diaspora, Michael Spavor, he didn't not even work on China issues. He was a Korea specialist. He happened to live in Northeast China because it was a more convenient place for him to travel to North Korea for his businesses. So he wasn't even involved in anything to do with China, but he got caught up as basically a political hostage in what happened. So I guess my answer is that there are no clear red lines and there's no clear way to avoid, you know, being targeted. And unfortunately, people of Chinese descent continue to be seen by Beijing as Chinese first and foremost. Living in China, in Beijing, like on a regular basis, this is when there is a lot of commonality between the Chinese state and Chinese society. Like my foreignness would be routinely denied. I couldn't tell people that I was Canadian. They wouldn't believe me. I would have to say that my family originates from Hong Kong. And even then people would say, oh no, you're Chinese, like Hong Kong isn't a separate identity. So that makes people of Chinese descent feel really vulnerable, and it does not make things better that police all around the world are not equipped to address when members of the diaspora are being intimidated, or if they fear arrest if they were to step foot on Chinese soil. I really don't have an answer for you on how to ensure your safety, say if you are a scholar working on these issues. I think a lot of people are feeling uneasy right now, and not only members of the Chinese diaspora, but many foreign scholars and students and researchers feel that it's risky to do any type of work related to China, unfortunately, in this current political climate, which may change in the future, but currently, I know of people who work on things like architecture in China, and they're not able to work there, and they've gotten feedback that, you know, it might be sensitive to work on their fields. So it is a pretty tough time right now, and I don't think it works in China's favor because of if you have less people who can act as bridges and to help really provide reliable information, then that leaves a lot of space and breathing room for disinformation about China to proliferate instead.
If I can just add one thing where I think this is actually a situation where, while academics often feel quite powerless in these kinds of situations, there's a simultaneous thing going on in sort of hawkish views about China and the Chinese Communist Party's presentation of China as well, both of which tends to try to present Chinese culture as a single unified thing. And by extension, then Chinese people of Chinese descent are somehow members of one group without many variations among them. So I think one of the exciting things going on within the academy, and at St. Andrews University, they have a really inspiring program about this, where there's graduate studies in Chinese culture in which you have to study a second Chinese language other than Mandarin. And there's a continual focus on just how varied cultural strains within China are and among different ways of thinking about Chineseness. So one of the ways that it's a very scary linking up of the Trump view of homogenization and the Beijing view of homogenization. So one way of pushing back within the academy is just to continually focus on the variation. I just saw a collection of short stories from Asia, and it said by each story translated from the Chinese, in parentheses Mandarin, or translated from the Chinese, in parentheses Cantonese. It's a tiny step, but it's one way of saying these are really different things, in the same way that you wouldn't want to say have anti-European sentiment and you couldn't distinguish between Italy, France, and Germany. It's something that just is a small thing I think we can do within the academy, to just talk often about varieties of Chineseness and breaking down this notion of homogeneity. There's a question back there.
Can I just make a quick
Oh, yeah,
comment?
sure.
I was really interested in reading Joanna's work, because she does have stories from all over the world, and these are, some of them are in important positions of influence, but a lot of them are just sort of everyday people. So I really respect that kind of on the ground, bottom up perspective. I wanted to just share that I've been working on a paper recently with one of our colleagues in law school on the effort to ban WeChat by President Trump. So there was an executive order that came out saying that you want to ban TikTok, you also want to ban WeChat. And there's a group of lawyers who are immigrant and transnational lawyers who, within 2 weeks, were able to mobilize and create a court case to challenge the President of the United States. But what's interesting to me is that they were heavily harassed, similar tactics to what the PRC government was doing. They were getting harassed by people who were conservative, Chinese immigrants, naming them, trying to expose their personal information. It was so interesting to see the replication of those tactics by people who are here, but on the other political side. So I think it does say something about our level of political discourse, or lack of discourse.
It's a question from Zoom. Yeah.
Yes, we're going here. Can you hear me okay? Not so much.
All right, a question from the Zoom audience. First, thank you for a great panel. A question, if I may. To what extent does the return to the Confucian tradition play in all these transformations? Thank you.
Anybody want to jump in on how is any of this a return to Confucian traditions?
I think I could just quickly add that I'm not sure if the Confucian kind of way of interacting in society really went away per se in China, and that there's now a return. The idea that there's different positions people have in society, I think was able to survive the Cultural Revolution to a large extent. And I think another tradition that is very influential in China's leaders is legalism, and also using laws and rules as a way to control society. I think perhaps that is more of a re-emergence from a older tradition. So looking at Hong Kong and looking at mainland China, it seems like as a journalist, there's constantly more and more different regulations and laws. Most recently, the one that got a lot of attention was authorities banning young people under 18 from internet gaming, except for a few hours on Friday evening. That's an example where it's one of many, many laws that are trying to control different aspects of life and society. And the more obvious example is the national security law in Hong Kong, which is so vague and it criminalizes previously very common social criticisms of the CCP.
Go ahead, Isabella. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So on my mind, there's a challenge to resituate China's state-market relations in the history of economic thought of China's own tradition and practices of statecraft, in order to link it back but in a way that avoids essentializing, that avoids suggesting that there's one eternal kind of Chinese way of doing it, while also avoiding the idea that anything that has ever been thought or practiced of any use in terms of market-state relations comes out of Western political economy with its origins around the time of the Industrial Revolution. So I think there's a huge research field that's wide open that takes the history of economic thought in both cultural contexts seriously, since it seems to be the case that China has indeed created a new kind of economic system that challenges us to come up with new ways of understanding it. And I think in order to pursue that project, we need a very wide repertoire of ways of thinking about the economy and cannot limit ourselves to some established standard models. So in that sense, I think that Chinese traditions of thought can be utilized without working towards some sort of monolithic understanding of China or China's history.
Yeah, I would just add that with many, and this piggybacks with something that Judy was saying earlier, many times when people want to place something into a purely China or purely influence from outside category that's going on in China, the answer is that it's both at some level. There's a very powerful book Sean Roberts brought out called The War on the Uyghurs, which talks about the way that the war on terror, the rhetoric of Islamophobia inside the war on terror was mobilized to present Uyghurs as a threat and to defend certain sets of activities. While at the same time, there's no question that the camp structure in Xinjiang has all sorts of things that are carried over from indoctrination camps and others that were going on in China in the Mao period and in other periods. And so to decide whether this is an influence coming in or something indigenous, we're always talking about blendings of these in the same way. And I think that's true with the economic system as well. There's a question over here, and then we'll alternate back and forth between in-person and externally. Yeah.
I just wanted to say what I find most ironic about the common criticism that China is not playing fair is that the most vocal critics of China's new programs, including the Belt and Road Initiative, come from industrialized Western countries, especially the United States, which attained political and economic hegemony not by following rules, but by acquiring and wielding the power to set the very rules which favor their current global dominance, especially the ones which preserve the conditions which allow the global minority of Western liberal democracies to continue rapidly consuming the world's finite resources while fearfully admonishing any of China's attempts at industrialization. So going off Professor Wasserstrom's point that Beijing and Washington aren't the only global players to pay attention to, are there any prominent specific trends that can be observed in the public opinions and attitudes of these global ports and locations that have been targeted by this new wave of Chinese developments? And have there been consistent and distinctly negative, positive, or mixed trends among them? And this is to anyone who wants to answer.
I'm not going to answer, but I just think that's a great question.
It is a great question. It's not in the books, right? What are the responses in Africa? What are the responses in Southeast Asia and so forth? These developments.
And I would just add, actually, because you brought in the another way of thinking about this. Yuan Ang has a book out on talking about China now being an equivalent of the Gilded Age. And I think one of the things is a lot of the things I mentioned, a lot of the discussions were what were people saying about Japan in the 1980s or Russia. But in the late 19th century, there were plenty of people that were saying the United States was developing really quickly by flouting the laws of the game. Charles Dickens came to America and said he couldn't believe he was getting no money from all the pirated editions of his books. It was great that they were reading them, which was very much like a discourse that you had in the last years about China. Judy, you want to jump
Oh, I would just add a quick comment that I forgot to respond to Judy earlier, that with the New Silk Road, I don't think it's like unilaterally this big scheme from Beijing to take over the world through investments. I think it's not purely a political scheme, but it's really advantageous for China to secure trade routes and have different projects for its very bloated state-owned enterprises to work on. So like the Port of Piraeus is, taken over for a period of 99 years by a state-owned company. And that definitely is not just in exchange for political leverage. It's definitely helpful for China's economy. And also Western countries and these middle powers play a really active role in signing up to work with Beijing and speaking with people who are very well connected in the Greek government. When Greece vetoed a human rights criticism tabled from the EU at the United Nations on China, and with that veto made it so that the bloc failed to issue this human rights criticism, what I heard from sources is that China did not ask Greece to do it. The Greek government did so kind of almost proactively as a sign of gratitude, or perhaps to ensure that China's investments in its economy will continue. So it's definitely not a one-way street where China's using its economic power to force Western countries and other countries to do what it wants. There is really a lot of proactive decisions that are coming out here from Western leaders.
Greg, you wanted to jump in there? And then Isabel?
Well, I let Isabella go first.
Okay, go first, Isabel.
Okay. Sorry, it's sometimes a bit hard to see who already has the hand up. Yeah, just one footnote on the question of Greece and Chinese investment. I feel as a German economist, I have an obligation to make that point. It's not least because of the imposition of austerity on the part of the EU and the IMF that this kind of situation arose in that way, right? So I think that is an important part of the story of Southern Europe that that has to be taken into account. But more to the point, I think it's an important point that was raised by that question, and I think it challenges us to ask what kind of standards are we measuring other countries against if we do not take into account what the living standards and the levels of development are. Shouldn't we rather compare to points in time where the living standards and developments were more similar and where our countries are trying to rise? So in that sense, resonating with what Professor Wasserstrom was saying, I think that JiaBin Huang has really made a marvelous contribution there in challenging us to rethink the point of comparison. And of course, Ha-Joon Chang's Kicking Away the Ladder also comes to mind, where this is not something that is new in the sense that suddenly in relation to China, new kind of standards are being applied that are not consistent with the development trajectory of Western countries, but this has been a long-standing practice in development economics, where often the demands were of a kind that is not consistent with the development trajectories of those who are making these demands on currently developing countries.
Sure, I was just going to jump in. It's a question I had for Isabella, but part of your book is sort of about this balance between sort of those who come with models, right, and prescriptions based on models, and those who are sort of more experience focused. And what I found really interesting in the book was the focus on Chinese bureaucrats, because bureaucrats, are the ones who are dealing day to day with prices and inflation challenges and so forth. And they seem to play a major role there. And in chapter 2 of your book, you talk about the US sort of post-war. But in many ways, it was sort of also a version of governance in the United States for a time, which was the New Deal and the role of administrative bureaucrats who were technocrats. And of course, that was challenged by the whole public choice theory, and that they became captured and so forth. And it seems to be, tell me if you think this is accurate, that at least not outside of monetary policy, which is going to be the central bank, but in terms of the Treasury, right, and the US administration, for those who have the experience, basically they come from Wall Street, they come from Goldman Sachs, right? They're the ones, and they obviously have a very different trajectory or sort of experience than someone who's a bureaucrat, who's in government. And is that a fair sort of contrast between the decision that the actors within decision making in the United States and China?
Can I respond to that right away? Yeah, okay. Yeah, great question. Yeah, absolutely. I think the reason why there is a book on the war economy in the United States and the transition from the war economy after World War II in the United States, the UK, and Western Germany is precisely to bring out that in certain situations, bureaucrats are actually behaving in very similar ways, even though the economic systems are very different and the political systems are very different, but pressed in a certain way, they seem to all be groping for stones to cross the river and turn into very pragmatic agents that are very much prepared to impose price controls, to intervene into the market, to use the market as a tool to create strong state governance of the economy and so on. And I think that in some sense, what we are observing right now in terms of the revival of a strong state and the revival of a very interventionist kind of policy agenda confirms this point, that in the context of the current challenges, in just to name the global pandemic as one of the myriad of massive challenges that our states and societies are facing, this kind of much more pragmatic, much more interventionist, much more state activist kind of attitude seems to be returning, which, by the way, I think also speaks to the previous question of what kind of standards do we want to hold countries and economies up against. In terms of the expertise of bureaucrats, I just want to make one more point in relation to the book, which is something that I have found quite striking, which is building really on the work of Sebastian Heimann and Elizabeth Perry, who have, of course, been arguing that the guerrilla warfare experience has shaped the policy thinking and policy practice to some extent in China in a very sustainable kind of fashion, where even today we sometimes still have repercussions of this kind of guerrilla type of thinking of experimentalist policy making. And I think that my book shows something in parallel, more focused on the economic sphere, where the thinking and practicing of the use of markets in China is really linked back to the experience of the 1940s and to the experience and practices of economic warfare, and in particular also the idea of out-speculating speculators, where after the revolution, the communists basically pulled together state commercial agencies to flood markets strategically with certain kind of commodities in order to reverse price hikes, which then resulted in out-speculating the speculators, driving them into bankruptcy, which I think is something in terms of a logic of operation that rings quite contemporaneously if we think about the situation around Evergrande, where it more and more looks like it's really been an example that has been statuated in the ways in which it has first been played up in ways that it looked like it might almost fail, and then it was still rescued. So in that sense, it hasn't been out speculated, but it's this very strategic economic way of interacting with bubbles of speculation that very much goes back to the very early days of the People's Republic.
Great. Do we have one more question from there on the Zoom world?
Okay, so a multi-part question for Isabella, and that is, were the Chinese talking about Chile at all in their debates over the merits and the risks of shock therapy? In the early 1980s, Chile's neoliberal makeover during the Pinochet military dictatorship was in acute crisis, so much so that the government has to moderate some of its policies. Even so, the economic crisis generated by shock therapy generated massive social movements that eventually brought Pinochet down. Surely the Chinese know this.
That's great, and I'm glad to get Latin America into the mix because that's someplace that figures in all of these stories. But I think this will need to be the last question, but yes. Isabella?
Sorry, I think I only heard the question 60%. So it was about Pinochet's Chile and shock therapy and how that had repercussions with China in the 1980s. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So in fact, of course, there were repercussions. I mean, Milton Friedman was in the UK and was exchanging letters with Pinochet about the idea of Big Bang price liberalization, invoking in both cases, and also in the Chinese case, the idea of the Erhard miracle, which was the immediate post-war moment in West Germany, where the idea was that you could recreate a functioning market economy pretty much overnight simply by letting go of prices. But also the political dimensions had repercussions with China. In fact, in some interviews, people have been hinting at the insight that apparently was around in the late 1980s, that if China was going to go ahead with a big bang in price reform, that would have only been possible at the cost of basically pursuing the same kind of outright violent suppression or bringing tanks to the streets that had happened in Pinochet. And in some sense, the situation in 1989 has some very tragic repercussions with precisely that history.
So we could go on for a long time with this. There's such big issues that are raised, but I just want to draw things to a close, thanking Ms. Chiu for joining us, and Professor Weber and Professor Shaffer and Professor Wu here. Thank you all for coming and for joining on as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.